welcome to this Insignia Reputation Management webinar. I am Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia Communications. For those of you who don't know us, we are a reputation management consultancy specialising in crisis and issues management. And during the course of 2014, we've held a series of these webinars looking at how social media has changed reputation management and in particular crisis management. In our first webinar we took a look from the company perspective. We talked to a train operating company about how social media had changed the way that they had to protect their reputation. More recently, we looked at some of the legal implications of social media on reputation management. And today, we're looking very specifically at a media perspective on social media, and in particular, how social media has impacted the way that news breaks these days, and of course, therefore, the implications for us as communicators and PR people. But we didn't just want to give you the reputation management consultant's perspective. We very much wanted to hear from the front line, the media front line, and we're very lucky to have with us today two panelists representing broadcast and print media. Richard Gaisford, Chief Correspondent for Good Morning Britain. So, not good morning, but good afternoon, Richard.
Good afternoon to you, Jonathan. Good afternoon.
And we have Anne Bird, who is representing the print media. Anne has written for, I think, most of the UK's national newspapers, including being Executive Features Editor and Health Editor on the Daily and the Sunday Express. So, afternoon to you too, Anne.
Afternoon, Jonathan, and good afternoon to everybody, or good morning, good evening, depending on where you're listening.
So, what we are going to look at this afternoon really is the results of a research study which we have just completed and which is being launched today. I'll tell you where to get hold of that report at the end of this webinar. But we spoke to a panel of 30 journalists from around the world representing broadcast and print media and coming from Europe, North America, the Middle East and Asia. And we spoke to them about how social media has changed their roles, their working lives, and therefore, as I say, for us to understand what that might mean for corporate communicators and PR people. So during the course of today's webinar, we'll be looking at what is the effect of social media on traditional journalism, what are the implications for how the media reports breaking news, and what that means for us as communicators and PR people when we're seeking to protect our organisation's reputations in a crisis situation. Now, I've already mentioned the communication and PR fraternity, so is this just a discussion for us? Well, another piece of research, not our research, tends to indicate that this is not just a discussion which concerns PR people. This is another piece of research which came out this week from an organisation called Eisner Amper, and they talked to board directors about what they thought the biggest risks facing their organisation were. Right at the very top of that list is reputational risk. And I would suggest, based on conversations with many clients over the last couple of years, that when people are concerned about reputational risk these days, one of the single most important reasons why that is a key concern is because of the advent of social media and the implications of that. So this is not just a discussion of relevance to PR people, it is also a discussion of interest to broader business people, executives and representatives of organisations. Moving on to our research though, what did we find out? We asked first of all, do you think the proliferation of citizen journalism and social media has reduced the importance of official media outlets? And interestingly, our respondents said on the whole, no. we believe that traditional media is equally important despite the proliferation of citizen journalism and social media. And maybe this quote from Martin Roberts gives a clue as to why that is the case. Martin, in his response, said, "Journalism is a profession like any other and needs to be practiced by qualified individuals. Citizen journalism is an oxymoron, just like citizen dentistry." And I don't think any of us would want to be operated upon by a citizen dentist. But Anne, turning it over to you, do you believe that's true? Do you believe that the traditional media is just as important these days as it ever has been?
I certainly still think it's very important, and I don't think it's a kind of either or. I think traditional media still exercises tremendous influence, and I did see some figures recently that said in Great Britain something around 80% of adults are consuming news every day. Now 73% of those are still getting it from print, and the rest of it are getting it from online, or at least a substantial chunk are getting it from online. So, for example, for the newspapers, they're still very, very important, but I think they have morphed. So they have changed. So obviously they've got a very strong online presence now. So not just the hard copy that you might get from the newsagents or might get delivered through the door. I did notice that even old newspaper publishers now tend to regard themselves and brand themselves as multi-platform digital operations. So I think we definitely, as newspaper organisations, see ourselves differently.
And Richard, do you think if that is true now, do you think that will continue to be true, that the traditional media retains its privileged position as the source of trusted information?
I think so, because I mean, I don't know what you're like in the morning when you wake up and you look for news. You won't want to plow through, thousands and thousands of tweets trying to work out for yourself what the news of the day is. You still need someone to curate that. You still need someone to take all of these different news sources, be they official media or citizen journalism, and work out what's going on, and then condense it into an easily digestible form that people can quite quickly, assimilate in their own minds what the big stories of the day are. And I think that's what's happening more. Actually, what it means is we have to work harder because there's so many more news sources out there to work out what's true, what's real, what's happening, what's relevant, put it all together, and then distill it for our audience. And of course, everyone has a different kind of audience, and those audiences find their own outlets. So that's how it's working. So yes, we still have a job, and I love that figure that you had, that 90% or so of us still think we're important, because of course in our own minds we are. But I would say in the public's mind still that we are important, because there is just a bewildering array of different news sources out there, and they still need people that they can trust.
Absolutely, and I think that trust word is the key word. There's lots more information critically, but not all of it is trusted. And so I do think that even with the advent of social media, indeed within social media, those trusted commentators, those trusted broadcasters, journalists, reporters still carry significant weight. And that kind of brings me on to the first set of implications for the people on this call. If the traditional media does retain that trust and that level of influence, it has implications for us. Firstly, ahead of a crisis, we need to identify who those key influencers are and ideally build relationships with them beforehand. In a crisis, when we're viewing all this melee and mass of noise and comment and views and speculation and rumour, we as the organisation in the centre of the crisis really need to identify the really important commentators and pull those apart from that general noise, and in particular apart from those expressing very extreme views. They tend to be the people that you're not going to be able to persuade anyway. Having identified who the influential commentators are on your crisis, monitor what they are saying to understand how they are shaping the narrative, and of course take steps to try and influence them by communicating with them, sending them information so that they are putting your story across, or your version of the story, as powerfully as possible. So knowing that the traditional media still have significant influence, work out how those people are, build relationships ahead of time, monitor and communicate with them during a crisis situation. A good example of that from a couple of years back was a little situation initially that affected London Underground, where a London Underground worker was very abusive to a passenger, an elderly passenger. Another passenger captured that exchange on their phone, posted it to YouTube. Really not a problem for London Underground at that point. It only became a problem when a tweet reached Sky News and then the Mayor of London, and they began tweeting about it. So identify those triggers, identify those individuals who turn a low-level incident into a major situation. Okay, let's turn our attention to the impact of social media on traditional media outlets. And given that we've just agreed that traditional broadcasters and newspapers have that privileged position, they are trusted, I guess it could be slightly worrying that 1 in 3 of our respondents to our survey said that they had shared social media content which subsequently turned out to be untrue or contained significant inaccuracies. And one of our US correspondents said, there is a danger that our trigger-happy fingers are tweeting too quickly. We need to stop and remember that it's important to process information and give the proper perspective and context. Richard, what causes a journalist to circulate inaccurate information via social media?
I think probably the rush to be first. What's happened is that we've gone from a traditional media of print deadlines at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and that's it, no change. Broadcast deadlines of the lunchtime news, the evening news, and the news at 10, and then no change to 24-hour news online, on television, and then 24 hours a day online. And there is this real rush to get stuff out there as quickly as possible. I think probably the biggest issue we have would be the retweet. Would be someone sending you information about a story that you're reporting on. You think it's credible. You may not have time to check it in the field. You think that it's a good story, and you press that retweet button. Always with the proviso that you're not necessarily endorsing it, and that is where I would say the majority of us would fall down. It is difficult. You do get caught up in a story. You do want to supply your followers and your viewers with the latest information, and that is perhaps where that happens. But still, I think most people would still be trying to check the information they'd be sent, and it may be that you are retweeting something from what you would seem to be a credible source, and then that source then pulls back on the story. But it does happen. It does all happen very quickly. It's happening within seconds, and perhaps that is the problem.
And are you perceiving increased pressure on journalists to get information out quickly, maybe even at the cost of quality or accuracy?
I certainly agree with what Richard was saying about there is always this rush to be first, to break the news. And I think the trouble is that inaccurate tweets have this ability to go further and have so much more impact than any correction that might follow, partly because they just obviously by their very nature they look more interesting, they read in a more interesting way than any correction. It's a bit like it was with newspapers and still is to a certain extent. If there is a mistake that's made, that might have been made, say, on the front page, the correction, and this is the big gripe with the public, the correction invariably is very small and a lot further into the newspaper. And it's a bit like that with a correction with an accurate tweet. I think also the other thing is that obviously journalists undergo a lot of training to know what they should and they shouldn't write, particularly, say, from a legal perspective. And the danger is that with a retweet, very often what I would call the kind of caveat words, so the things like suggests or indicates or the allegedly, because the retweet has to be done in 140 characters, those words are getting taken out, and then you can run into real problems. So you might have, for example, a high-profile celebrity court case, and somebody retweets that the defendant got off, which is very different from saying they were acquitted.
Yes.
Inaccuracy can cause huge problems.
Recently I was out in Spain reporting on the case of Asher King. I don't know, maybe our international audience may not know the story. It may have made the papers, of a young boy whose parents took him from hospital suffering from a brain tumor. An international arrest warrant was issued. They were then arrested in Spain, put into jail. The point of this is that their son actually tweeted that they had been released from jail when you knew that process was in place. Actually, that wasn't true. But even the BBC ran with that. And in fact, the BBC ran with that first. And the BBC is famously the organisation that will always want to check things with 3 separate sources before it goes to air. That you can see where the problem lies. You have a trusted source, the Sun, somebody who you've been dealing with, the flow of information that had been coming. In the excitement of it all, they tweeted something that was incorrect. The next thing, every single media outlet in the country is reporting it. That actually did happen, but it happened 3 hours later. So people who were following the story closely actually were getting a prediction of the news rather than something that actually happened.
There are tools that are starting to appear, though, that are addressing this kind of issue. For example, there are tools now that will notify people en masse that you've made changes to a tweet, so you can at least reach all those people that have tweeted or retweeted inaccuracy.
So again, we're clearly seeing a challenge here for us as communicators representing organisations. If we want to protect the reputation of those organisations, inaccurate tweets or coverage of our situation is likely to be unhelpful. So notwithstanding the challenges that we've heard about, here are some of the implications and some suggestions as to how to address that challenge. The first one is simply to monitor social media really actively, really closely in a crisis. You need to know when inaccurate information is being communicated about your organisation or your situation. So spotting it quickly is critical if we're to have any chance of addressing it. Be particularly vigilant for important inaccuracies coming from those trusted media sources, like the BBC, for example. And as soon as you spot them, connect with that source, give them the correct information and ask them to rectify it. As Anne said, it doesn't completely put the genie back in the bottle, and you need to do this very, very quickly because rumour becomes perceived as fact incredibly quickly on social media. So again, speed is going to be of the essence. To balance as well, though, you need to be prepared to communicate your own accurate information quickly and prolifically. We all understand that social media is a very fast medium and one that twists and turns and changes very quickly. So you need to get information out there much quicker than we all used to have to do in the old days, and you need to communicate much more often than before. The idea of, one press release a day or even 3 a day are long gone. If you want to influence and if you want accurate information to be out there, it's about communicating continually during a crisis. Continue to respond actively to further inaccuracies. The bottom line is, by the way in which you use social media and by the quality of what you say and the speed of which you say it, your goal is to establish yourself as one of the key credible sources of information. It's your organisation, your reputation, your incident. You want to be seen as the go-to spokesperson and source of information on that situation. So let's take a closer look at the impact of social media on traditional media outlets, because whilst our respondents absolutely still see the traditional media as being crucially important, almost 9 out of 10 also confirmed that social media has changed the role of traditional media in breaking news stories. How has it done that? Well, broadly it falls into 2 categories. The first category is what we're seeing here on the left-hand side of the screen, hearing about potential stories more quickly and being able to report on them more quickly. And one of our UK TV correspondents commented, Twitter is increasingly seen as the place to break news stories. Is that something that you recognise, Richard?
It absolutely is, and when you see that David Cameron, the Prime Minister, is now using Twitter as the forum to announce what is happening on major stories of public interest, you can see that recently, we had the situation developing with ISIS or Islamic State in Syria. He announced the recall of Parliament on Twitter, and it is the quickest, most democratic way of announcing a story. In the past it would have been a fax or an email to the Press Association. Only those who got the Press Association wire would have seen the initial breaking news. They would have then broadcasted or retransmitted it. It would have taken minutes. Now it's happening in seconds. Whether or not the Prime Minister is actually doing those tweets is another matter. But it's coming from someone very close. And again, one would only hope it is a trusted source.
And your perspective as Twitter as the place to break news stories these days?
It certainly is, and I think this is in many ways great news for businesses, for example, because it means that they can tweet their news or use social media to get their news out there without actually bypassing media outlets. So there's no temptation to edit or spin it in any particular fashion. As for the news organisations themselves, for example, newspapers, it's been many years now since newspapers decided to start breaking news on their own websites. I mean, for two reasons really, partly because of the speed of getting the story out there rather than waiting for the newspaper to hit the next morning, but also because advertising revenues, it was much greater online than in the newspaper. Certainly that was one of the reasons that they gave, so that's another reason why they prefer to break the stories online.
And Richard, I wondered if you could just kind of paint us a little picture. We talked in the research, I'll just go back to that slide, about hearing about potential stories more quickly and then reporting them more quickly. Could you paint a picture of how both of those elements of the process work, how stories come to your attention, how you're monitoring Twitter, and then what happens next when you're made aware of a breaking story?
Well, you tend to follow a set number of sources yourself. Of course, they also follow multiple sources. That all then comes into your Twitter feed as people tend to then re-report information. Take a story like major flooding, for instance. Everyone knows that there are flood alerts there. People are looking for flooding stories, but of course you're never quite sure where and when it's going to happen. If people are using the hashtags, perhaps UK floods or floods, something like that, you can monitor to see where they are starting to spike. Then you start to get a picture. Then you start to drill down to those particular areas by searching on the area names or other hashtags that have been associated with that story. You start to build very quickly an idea about the story. When you see it from multiple sources, perhaps you then get the emergency services tweeting as well. You then start getting your tail, and you can package it all together. And that can all happen incredibly quickly. You start to get flash flooding in a town because the river's risen, it's clashed with the tide. Everyone's tweeting pictures, information. It's pretty clear what's happening once you have that visual picture as well that is delivered on Twitter. And I think to me that's incredibly useful. It's not just the words that we're seeing, but it's also the pictures as well. And that really helps us, of course, in television, but also for the newspaper websites as well.
And I was going to say, I mean, is this, in terms of reporting stories more quickly, we touched on it earlier, but I mean, how much due diligence would you do before posting a tweet yourself?
Well, it depends. If I'm the eyewitness to that story and it's my story, then there's no need. I can just go ahead and do it. And quite often on a story, that's part of the joy of it, is that I may only have a minute or 2 minutes on air to tell my story and to tell people what I've seen, what I've experienced, to give people that information. I was in Iraq a couple of times over the summer period in Erbil in Kurdistan. Had some incredible tales with people that I'd managed to interview, refugees who'd fled from Islamic State. And then you can go on with Twitter and fill in the blanks, post pictures of people, explain what their stories are, give people some background information, and then start answering questions from followers as well. It is a remarkable thing that it's suddenly become two-way. I first discovered this in Chile during the Chilean miners. I was out there by a hole in the ground in the Atacama Desert, watching these men being hiked out of the ground. It was amazing for me, amazing for their families who were standing all around, but we were able to share it, and I think that's when I first understood the power of Twitter, that with a story that grabbed the global interest like that of the Chilean miners, suddenly you were able to share it with a wider audience and answer people's questions as well, and get really involved with the world as they watch this story.
Excellent, thank you. And talking about questions, I should say to everyone on this webinar, we will be taking 5 or 10 minutes of questions at the end, and if you could put those questions using the messaging function on your control panel, you can ask those questions as soon as you like. We'll store them up for the end, but as things occur to you, please do feel free to send those questions through to us. Okay, so the first dynamic we were seeing there is the speed of recognizing a story and the speed of covering a story. I think the second category is something that Richard touched on there. The big change is getting access to all sorts of material and people that the media would have found it a lot harder or slower to get hold of a few years back, whether that's access to unofficial information sources, i.e. not the company spokesperson, eyewitness accounts, interviewees, so spotting that someone is tweeting about an air disaster, they suddenly become a prime target for the media to be interviewed on air or for the newspaper. Images and video for reports and stories, almost always the first images in a news story these days are from someone's mobile phone. And even, although less so, actually taking what has been said on Twitter or other social media and using that as part of the news story itself. Anne, is that something that you recognise happening within the print media?
Yes, I do, and actually it's been happening for quite a while, I think. Think of the story of the 2009 New York plane crash, when the plane landed in the Hudson River. I mean, that was a story that broke on Twitter probably a good 15 minutes or so before it broke through the mainstream media. But I think journalists on traditional media are certainly using social media to help source stories, and particularly things like, I think not just the news desk, but also the features desks as well, who might be following up news stories. They'll be using things like Twitter to try and track down case studies, for example, just through using things like, hashtag journo request. It's become a far simpler process for journalists to get in touch with people that might be able to add another layer to their story, and also for sourcing things like pictures as well. Thank you.
And here's an interesting quote from BBC TV correspondent Ben Ando, and in particular the first sentence, which may send shivers down the spine of us official communicators. Social media can be useful in bypassing official channels for information. Richard, why might you want to bypass the official channels?
Because they're probably just being a little too slow, and that's part of the issue, especially for someone like me who will be getting up at 3:30 in the morning. Official press offices not open until 8 or 9. There is a story developing overnight. I want to get the latest information on it, and it's not always there. What you would do is you'd be looking on Twitter to see what other people are saying. As Anne was saying, seeing if you can find those case studies, people who've been affected. We're always having airports that are grinding to a halt because baggage machines have gone wrong, or people have gone on strike. You want to get to the people that are affected by it. People are tweeting pictures. You get them. You want to speak to them, arrange an interview, and that is how you do it. So if you wanted to wait until 9 o'clock in the morning, maybe to the press offices there, see if you can get access, see if you can get in, that's fine. That's not the business we're in. We need to get the news on the air as quickly as we possibly can, and if it means getting out there on Twitter and making an appeal for people to come forward or looking for that information ourselves, that's what we do.
And if we go back to that previous slide, the one area where journalists are maybe not fully using material directly from social media is that very final one. Only 20% said they would actually take quotes from social media to be used within articles or to be broadcast. Why is that, and do you see that potentially, though, increasing over time?
I think that might come back to the whole accuracy issue, really, but it may still be that the social media has allowed a contact to be made. In the same way that we would say to PRs, it's probably not a good idea to pitch a story to journalists using social media, but social media is a good place to start to build up a relationship. So it may be that via social media the print journalist does get to somebody that provides a quote, but it's a quote that they can sort of check and verify and are happy with, rather than just lifting something straight off social media.
Thank you. A second perspective in terms of access, I found this quite interesting, again from one of our US correspondents. Media are increasingly seeing social media as a quicker and more direct route through to organisations compared with calling corporate communications. The difference is that those interactions are visible to everyone else. So that's food for thought. What this journalist is saying is not that they're going to fully unofficial sources, but they're going to the organisation, but not via the prescribed routes. And so I think that throws up question marks for us as people within communications departments. Are there processes for briefing and coordinating the people who are managing, for example, our Facebook page? Because a journalist will go straight to them for information if they're not getting the speed of response from the corporate communications team. So be aware that it's not just outsiders that the media are targeting, but insiders, just not the insiders that you had prescribed to be the first responders. And I think Roop also makes a very interesting point, is that, of course, the other difference is that whereas a phone call to the corporate communications team is just that, a phone call, that interaction via your Facebook page or via Twitter is visible to the entire outside world to see. So it's something to be very, very aware of. What we then asked our respondents was what their pleas would be to organisations communicating in a crisis. How could they use social media more effectively to communicate with the media and other stakeholders? So these were the request/suggestions of our media respondents. Top of the list came begin communicating more quickly, which very much echoes Richard's comment about, you know, we won't necessarily go to them because they'll be too slow. So the media are calling on organisations to be quicker. Interrelated, 80% of respondents are calling on organisations to communicate more frequently and more regularly. Thirdly, about 75% are asking organisations to engage in dialogue rather than just broadcasting information. And I think, you know, people in crisis used to send messages out, organisations did. That's not really an effective or acceptable way of operating on social media. It's much more discursive rather than one-way broadcasting. The media are asking for links to useful information or content. 6 in 10 are asking for organisations to respond directly to individual media requests. This, I think, comes back to not just one broadcast message to everyone, but a bit more tailoring and a bit more responsiveness. And in tone of voice, over half of our journalists are saying, can you be a little bit less corporate? Can you adopt a slightly more informal tone of voice? Now, of course, that will depend on the kind of organisation you are. If you're a merchant bank, probably your tone of voice is going to be different compared to if you're a children's brand, for example. But Anne, any surprises there? Any organisations you've seen applying some of these principles either particularly well or maybe even particularly badly?
It's very interesting, Jonathan, the one about adopting a less corporate approach. And in actual fact, there have been a couple of great examples of where doing just that has become a story in itself, certainly here in the UK. The one that springs to mind was only a couple of months ago with Greggs, the major bakery chain here, where an offensive logo had appeared on their Google profile. Greg then tweeted Google to fix it and attached a photograph as well of a tray full of donuts, and basically said, if you can fix it quickly, these donuts will be yours. Well, it was great to see actually Google responded in kind, suggesting that if Greg's threw in a sausage roll, they'd be even quicker to do it. That story was huge, and of course then ran in all the traditional news media as well, which was fantastic PR, I think both for Greg's and for Google, really. Another one was the retail chain here, Argus, who had received a tweet from somebody very much in sort of street patois and street language, basically asking about when was the PlayStation 4 going to arrive, and instead of responding in a corporate comms manner, they tweeted in return in sort of street language. And again, this is widely applauded in all the traditional and digital media as well, so great success there.
Richard, any examples that come to mind for you?
Of course, I'm the cynical hack who always thinks of where people could have used it better. I would think back to 2012, Costa Concordia hitting the rocks off the island of Giglio, just off the Tuscan coast in Italy. That was an opportunity, I think, for a company to really have gone to social media to explain what was happening, to give updates, to reassure customers on other ships and potential customers and people who were waiting to go on holiday. I didn't see that. They certainly didn't put anyone on the ground to come and talk to us. You know, that was a missed opportunity, a major crisis for a company that relies on, you know, the customers booking their holidays, having faith in them, and they just weren't communicating. And I realized that we're 2 years down the line, and that people are developing how they communicate with people, but it was a major lesson learned for them, and I think one that others in that field probably have learned, specifically airlines actually, who I think are much better now at getting on with customer gripes, via Twitter, addressing them quickly, helping people out. I recently just flew to Iraq. Turkish Airlines managed to lose almost all of our baggage. Now, we didn't actually mention their Twitter handle in any of the tweets we were discussing as to where our body armor and our various bits of equipment had gone, but they got onto it and very quickly managed to resolve the situation. And it seemed that we weren't the only ones who were having a problem with them at the time. So you can see that you know, for organizations like that rely very much on building faith and having a bond with their customers, that getting to them, getting back to people quickly through social media and keeping people informed of developing situations is incredibly important.
It comes back to that maxim, Jonathan, about we don't stop covering the story just because an organisation doesn't talk to us, and that goes for social media as well.
Absolutely, and just picking up on the example of airlines and aviation examples, frequently it's organisations that get it wrong that get lots of comment. I did just want to draw your attention to another couple of good examples, both of which are on our own blog, so you can read about them at greater length if you go onto our website. But one was the recent terrorist threat, or perceived terrorist threat, for a Qatar airliner heading towards Manchester Airport. All of the parties involved in that situation made prolific use of Twitter to keep people informed, and therefore minimised some of the rumour and speculation which would otherwise have been the case. So it was Manchester Airport itself, Qatar Airlines, the police and the Ministry of Defence were all tweeting prolifically, which, as I say, helped to communicate fact rather than rumour about that situation. Another great example of a less corporate tone of voice, and those of you who've been on previous webinars will probably have heard me talk about this, and I think there might be some TSB people on the line again on this webinar, but TSB's response to a service outage this year was also very, very well judged in terms of its tone of voice. Indeed, the Chief Executive, Paul Pester, personally was interacting with concerned customers. And the interesting thing in that situation was that the organisation's well-judged response became as much of a story as the incident itself, which is very similar to the Greg's incident that Anne was mentioned. So get it right. Not only do you control the initial incident itself, but you actually move the agenda on and can actually attract plaudits for the way that you have done that. Not easy to achieve, but a fantastic trick if you can do it. Okay, so some thoughts on what you might need to be doing beforehand if you are to meet the media expectations that we saw on the previous slide. Firstly, I've probably said it twice already, but here's the third time because it's so important. Get your social media monitoring in place beforehand. You must know what is being said about you, or else you have very little opportunity to move at the required speed in response to an emerging incident. I'd also encourage organisations to engage actively with social media channels during business as usual when the going is good. Doing that will build followers. It will get the organisation used to using social media, and it will help with getting that appropriate tone of voice, which will be so important during a crisis. And it was one of the reasons that O2, the mobile phone service provider, responded so well when they had a service outage, was because they had used social media so effectively during business as usual that it was natural for them to use it effectively during a crisis situation. As we mentioned earlier, identify who the key influencers are and build relationships with them, and that means online and offline. Plan where you will host your online information hub in a crisis. You will almost certainly, in a major situation, want to use social media to drive interested stakeholders to a central repository of information and a variety of resources. Identify beforehand where you will host that online information hub and how you will activate it in the event of an incident. Make sure your social media channels are integrated into your crisis communication plan. If you don't have social media covered off within the crisis communication plan, then there's undoubtedly a gap there, so make sure it is integrated. Approval procedures will be one of the thorny issues that you may face, so articulate how tweets and other social media comments are to be approved during a crisis. Identify and prepare the human and technical resource you will need to activate and man your social media presence. You'll need probably 5 to 10 times more people than on a normal day, so work out where you're going to get those people from, whether it's from your agency, from your customer call center, wherever it's going to be. You will need more resource than on a normal day. Create as many materials beforehand. Again, if we want to fill that information vacuum and communicate accurate information, having images of people, products and places, your sites, your products, your key executives, maps, graphics, corporate facts and figures, having those ready, produced beforehand, again, helps you to fill the vacuum and helps you achieve that objective of being seen as the key credible source of information. But you won't be able to prepare everything beforehand, so know how you would be able to produce new materials in the heat of a crisis. So, for example, it sometimes makes sense for an executive to put a message out via YouTube. Work out beforehand, if you needed to do that, how would you do it, particularly if it was 6:30 in the morning? Who would film it? Who knows how to upload it? How would you get hold of your executives to be filmed? So work out beforehand rather than find out during the crisis that you don't know how to do that or you're unable to do it. And finally, rehearse. If you were a symphony orchestra and you were about to perform in front of thousands and thousands of people, you wouldn't do so without a rehearsal. If your organisation ends up in the media spotlight in front of millions of people in a crisis, you do not want to be performing without a rehearsal. So conventional crisis simulation exercises and bespoke social media simulations will get the organisation match fit to learn lessons but then perform to a higher level if you ever have to manage a situation for real. And it won't surprise you to know that Insignia can help you with both of those things. So we are now going to take a few questions, but before doing so, I just wanted to ask Anne, and before we move on to questions, anything you wanted to add at this point?
I think I just endorsed that bit about rehearsing really and preparation. I think if people ever think that the cost of planning or preparation is expensive, believe me, it's nothing compared to the cost of many a crisis, as so many organisations have literally found out to their cost.
Richard?
Yes, no, I mean, I'm always amazed how many people don't go through crisis training and crisis management. I meet quite a lot of them on a regular basis. It would just be to spend a few hours thinking about the tone that you might adopt, to think about the kind of language that is applicable online would be great, and to how you can actually use it to your advantage, to take advantage of a situation, to try and turn a bad situation around, and so that you're not left with egg on your face.
Thank you. So we have 10 minutes remaining, and we do already have a number of questions. We'll get through as many of them as we can before 2 o'clock UK, but we will finish on the dot of 2 o'clock. So the first one is, it seems that Twitter is the favoured social media tool of journalists. Would you say that Facebook has had its day? I don't know which of Richard or Anne would like to field that one first.
I'll go first on the fact that Twitter for me is the news source for journalists. Facebook has never really been the way that I or many of my colleagues have gone out looking for stories. Twitter just seems to be so much more immediate. I struggle now with the timeline and the news line on Facebook. It doesn't seem to give me the information that's coming sequentially and is delivering it as quickly as I would like to see it. And I would think that the way that it just seems more democratic, Twitter, and that just seems to be a much better way of gathering news.
Anne?
I'd agree with that actually. I'm a big fan of Twitter as well, but probably worth just giving a quick mention here to WhatsApp as well. That I think is particularly popular in certain areas, so in parts of the developing world, just simply because where there may be a cost implication. I mean, WhatsApp has proved extremely popular, but no, I'm a Twitter person every time over Facebook.
Okay, and for me, that's one of the reasons why Twitter is so important. You know, I come across organisations still who say Twitter isn't important, I don't get it, we're not the kind of organisation that needs to be on Twitter. My view is, you know, even if it doesn't necessarily sit comfortably with you as an organisation, some of the key influencers on your business and your reputation, in particular the media, are very heavily represented on Twitter. And so almost for no other reason than that, if you can't find a million other reasons, I think organisations need to understand and embrace Twitter as part of their communication and reputation management activity. We have two questions here which relate very closely to the same topic, which is that of employees using social media. So one person asks, many employees of an organisation tend to send thoughts, experiences, incidents which can be picked up by the media. This is extremely difficult for an organisation to control. What's the best way to solve this? And another person says, whilst we might not like traditional journalism being usurped by citizen journalism, it is happening. What mitigants can an organisation have against this happening? Is involving its own employees a good idea to spread the company's message? So one person, I guess, asking how can we control employees' use of social media, another one saying how can we use employees communicating via social media. So I'll give you my perspective, and then Richard and Anne, please feel free to chip in. I think the first thing to say is all organisations should have a social media policy which is known by employees, so that at least the broad rules of the game are understood by employees. I'm now far from being a young man, and certainly people like my son and people his age, they just view communicating about everything on social media as perfectly acceptable. So the idea of confidentiality, privacy, secrecy is not so well understood by teenagers and people in their 20s, which is why, you know, a social media policy is your first step in defining what is and what isn't acceptable. I think we need to expect that employees will communicate using social media in a crisis, even if we have guided them to be careful or not communicate about certain topics. We have to be realistic and expect that will happen. And I think in a best case, if we can actually communicate internally with our people really effectively, really quickly, there is the potential for them to become key advocates and very positive reinforcers of our message on social media. One of the things, though, that I would seek to avoid is either coercing employees to say positive things about us online, or even worse, posing as regular employees and managers posting as though they were a regular employee, and that certainly can get you into really deep water. So summary for me, it's probably a whole webinar in its own right, but make sure your employees know where they stand, expect that they will communicate using social media, and brief them really well during the crisis so that they can be your best ambassadors rather than your worst nightmare. Anne, Richard, anything to add to that, or how you might want to use regular employees as sources during a crisis?
I agree with what you said there, Jonathan, about the social media policy. I think all organisations should have that. So at least employees have some sense of the parameters and what is and isn't acceptable. I also agree that you can't completely control what your employees are going to say, and nor should you. And I think Richard and I would say, well, thank goodness that you don't really, because those employees are often such good sources of information. A general rule of thumb for anybody that's using social media has to be, you know, don't put anything out there that you wouldn't want the whole world to know about.
Well, that's fine, and I know that when I tweet with the same thoughts as I do when I broadcast. Don't say anything that you wouldn't say on the television, because it's going to get you into a lot of trouble if it's wrong or you upset somebody. But also I know that my bosses follow me on Twitter. I'm absolutely sure that if the employees of these organizations all felt that their bosses were also following them on Twitter and perhaps interacting with them as well, it might help curb any natural enthusiasm that could get them into some sort of difficulty. What I do like to see is organizations that retweet comments from their employees. Sometimes you see that. It's quite useful. It's a way of getting an idea that employees are happy, that they're proud of their brand or what they're doing. That's a good way of perhaps using Twitter as a positive to get your employees' points of view over.
We've got about 3 minutes left, so a quick answer to the next question, and I'm afraid there are a couple we aren't going to be able to deal with, but we'll maybe connect with people individually who haven't had their question answered. And if I can summarise this next question briefly, the question really is, if I, as a corporate communications manager or PR officer, have built a relationship with you beforehand and been a respected, trusted provider of information in the past, will you cut me some slack? Will you give me a little bit more time to get back to you than someone that you have never come across before? Or does the reality of the crisis mean you're just going to cover it just as quickly anyway?
No, I would. If I genuinely felt that I had a relationship with somebody and that they were genuinely telling me that they needed to go away for a few minutes, half an hour, or whatever it was to get the information for me, then I would. There's no point in trying to stitch somebody up. If I felt though that that's exactly what they were trying to do to me, then I'm sure that I would go elsewhere. But if someone genuinely was being helpful, I had a relationship with them, of course, you were given that time to make sure that the story was right.
Thank you. Okay, so I'd just like to draw your attention to where you can get further crisis management materials and insights following this webinar. Firstly, we are offering to the first 5 people, and I'm afraid these have to be UK people, who request one, a complimentary crisis management audit. That takes the form of a 1-hour face-to-face meeting when we'll run a facilitated discussion to see how your current crisis management practices stack up against best practice, and then do you a benchmarking report on the back of that. Either use that email address to request that or respond to the email that will come out this afternoon. If there are any questions emerging from this webinar, please feel free to contact me directly by email or telephone. And if you're interested in crisis management thoughts, materials, links, please follow me on Twitter. I tend to talk about reputation and crisis management matters a lot, not just Insignia stuff, but more broadly. So please follow me on Twitter. With regard to the research report itself, that is now on our website. So you can download the full report that this webinar was based on from our website. And again, there will be a link to that from the email that you will receive this afternoon. There are other resources on that page as well, including the previous webinars. And we will intend running our next reputation management webinar in January. So firstly, thank you so much to Richard and Anne for joining us. Your insight and experience, I'm sure everyone will agree, has been invaluable and added a lot of value to this session. So thank you, Richard, and thank you, Anne.
It's been a pleasure, Jonathan. I would just urge anyone who feels that perhaps that they want to experience a crisis to just search Dropbox at the moment on Twitter. Dropbox is having a major nightmare on Twitter at the moment, and we're quite interested for people who just listened to this discussion to see what's happening, what's being said about them, and perhaps what they are doing or could do to make their situation better.
And Anne, thank you to you too.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
And thank you for everyone who's joined us. This will also be available as an audio recording and the presentation via our website. As I say, any further questions, do just drop me a line. Thank you all very much, and please have a crisis-free afternoon. Thank you.